any man who looks out upon the world through the eyes of Christ does not want to serve the world simply as an obedience to a command, he becomes the captive of an inner necessity which will not let him rest.
It all began here on an April night in 1909. The occasion was a revival meeting in Waycross, Georgia. He got religion, and religion got him, and neither would ever be the same again. Born in the hamlet of Argyle on December 26, 1888, Arthur Moore grew up in the small South Georgia town of Brookfield on the edge of the Okefenokee Swamp. He was the oldest of 5 children born to John and Emma Cason Moore. Enjoying a childhood not unlike that of most of the other boys of rural Tift County, young Arthur fully expected to follow in his father's footsteps and live his life as a railroad man. But while he was still only 11, fate and Cupid had another idea: Martha McDonald.
When I was a young boy, about 9 or 10 as I remember, a young lady about approximately the same age came to our quiet little village. She lived down in Waycross, 60 miles away. We were out playing one afternoon. She expressed a desire for a watermelon, which I promptly bought and had it charged to my father. My mother could see the whole transaction, and she let me alone until I'd had my party and then called me home. Well, it was Judgment Day for me, but I finally got the girl. Years go by, not many of them, and she was teaching school in a town through which I passed, and there we saw each other. And finally, at an age maybe too young to be defended by the experts, but for us just right, she became my wife. And my life and my whole ministry is to be explained, if it is to be explained, by her love and loyalty. She has outrun me into the Father's house, but someday I'll be with her there and be happy as I've been here.
The man who was later to become one of the world's most famous Methodists was actually Baptist until the age of 14. At that time, he was read out of the Baptist church for being present at a party where they danced what they called the twistification. But after his marriage to Martha, a devout Methodist, she prodded him more and more in the direction of the church. Then came the conversion at Waycross.
Conversion for me was more than a matter of having one's sins forgiven. It was a new life, lived out under a new purpose, in a new world. But the radiance of that first night abides in my heart, and I hope manifests itself in my life.
While still serving as a flagman, Arthur now began to fill his off-duty hours with all kinds of church activities. His first opportunity to preach came within the year.
It's not easy for me to pinpoint the exact hour in which my ministry of preaching ministry began. But I remember going out to a little church in the rural area and stayed up most of the night looking for a text that I could talk about next morning. And at about midnight I found the statement, "Seek ye the Lord while he may be found." So I got up and didn't say much about the text, preached too long. And while we were singing the closing hymn, the stewards, 3 of them, met over in the corner of the church house and came round, and when the hymn had ended, and rapped on the table and said, "We've decided there will be no night meeting." They couldn't take it. But that was the beginning, and 50 years rolled by, and I went back to that same little rural church, took the same text, preached another long sermon. I'm not sure it was any better, but at least they didn't cancel me out.
Before his conversion at the age of 20, Arthur Moore had never made a public speech. Now he had found an impressive new eloquence. But God had just begun to work his miracles in the life of Arthur J. Moore. Ralph McGill, the famous Atlanta newspaperman, expressed it this way in his Saturday Evening Post article of 1951.
In August of that year, 1909, while Arthur was still with the railroad, the presiding elder sent for him. Down at St. Mary's, Georgia, an old pre-revolutionary seaport town at the mouth of the river of the same name, an elderly minister named John W. Simmons was critically ill. "I want you to go down there and preach in Dr. Simmons's place," the presiding elder told him. "You've got it in you. Pray with Dr. Simmons and preach." So, at 20 years of age, possessed of only a common school education, an unlicensed layman, he obtained leave from his job and preached for 6 weeks at St. Mary's. When he presented himself before the conference in late October to request a license, there was also before the bishops a request from the St. Mary's congregation to send back the young preacher. He received the license, but the assignment was a circuit of 7 isolated rural churches in agricultural McIntosh County. The 7 towns echo yet to the preaching of the young circuit rider. He was a sort of ministerial Paul Bunyan. Elisha Thorpe of Townsend had lent him an old half-blind white horse which would not step over logs, a handicap on a circuit where much of the riding was through woods with years of accumulated logs felled by age and storm. But Moore went everywhere. He would walk up and down beside the plowmen in the fields, talking to them about the Gospels. He and his old horse would arrive at a lonely clearing at dusk. The minister would chop wood, help to milk, and that night before the fire, or if in summer out in the yard in straight kitchen chairs, he would talk of God's mercy to the family about him. He visited every house in the wide circuit, seeking out lonely cabins and distant clearings. Great crowds came long distances on Sundays to hear him preach. He was, as his listeners said, on fire with the Word.
The lonely life of the circuit rider was deeply satisfying to the young preacher. But when another opportunity presented itself, he and Martha decided it was best to take their 2 babies and go. And so the next 2 years were spent at Emory at Oxford, a short distance from Atlanta. It was a pleasant change of pace for the man so accustomed to constant travel. There was time for study and even a little baseball and tennis. He recalls with great pleasure the hour in the evening just before dinner. He would take the 2 babies with him to the tennis court, put them on a blanket in one corner, and enjoy his game while Martha prepared the evening meal. His ability in the pulpit soon became known, and he was in great demand in the surrounding communities. A sizable group of fellow students often accompanied him, and the congregations of the small rural churches good-naturedly complained that if they did not arrive early, Moore's mobile congregation took all the seats. In fact, his zeal for evangelism and his eagerness to satisfy the debts he had incurred prompted his decision to leave college after 2 years. Now he could devote all of his time to his first love, preaching. He was appointed district evangelist and took to the road with his tent. And he reverted to the old practice of going to out-of-the-way communities where messengers of the word were scarce. He organized churches and won thousands of converts. Word got around that when Arthur Moore converted someone, it took. Eloquence without pretense, impact without hysteria. Preaching, 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 as many places as possible, as often as possible, always on the go, always drawing the large crowd. He was moved up from district evangelist to general evangelist, and was now able to preach in practically all of the United States. On completing a revival in one town, it was not uncommon to have the bulk of the congregation hire a special train to follow him to the next. The young preacher would sometimes remove the windows and doors from the halls or churches to better accommodate the overflow crowds. And then in the fall of 1920, in the midst of a typical Moore revival, a new chapter began.
One day while I was preaching in San Angelo, Texas, I received a Western Union telegram from Bishop Ainley. It said, "I'm today transferring you from the South Georgia Conference to the West Texas Conference, and I expect to appoint you as minister of the Travis Park Church in San Antonio." That was a great surprise to me and a great honor. I passed the telegram around to 3 or 4 preachers who were having lunch with me. I didn't know preachers ever got jealous of each other, and they were a bit surprised that the bishop would bring in a young man without much experience and give him this great downtown church.
From traveling rural evangelist to the pastorate of a large urban church, and finally an assignment to the largest in all of Methodism at that time, the First Church of Birmingham, Alabama. His outstanding record in both cities proved the wisdom of the changes.
During all of those wonderful years in San Antonio, 6 of them to be exact, I was able to invite and to receive into the membership of the church an average of 600 a year, 3,600 for the 6 years I was there. When I went to Birmingham, a great downtown church with good deal of prestige, I wondered if I could do it, but by the grace of God, we had about the same result, about 600 additions a year, making a total of 6,000 souls won to Christ and the church in 10 years.
But even the most serious activities of church administration and soul winning sometimes have a lighter side.
After I had been assigned to the First Methodist Church in Birmingham, before very long we had a citywide election on what we call an open Sabbath. The movies were not allowed to run on Sunday. Dr. Stewart had always led the opposition, and now he's gone to heaven, and this unknown young man has come, and they elected me to be the chairman. And I knew that if we lost that election, we not only lose a good cause, but people would say if Dr. Stewart had been here, we never would have lost it. But I did the best of good, and happily we won by a big majority. That was Saturday. Sunday morning, the advocates, some advocates of the open Sabbath, came down and put some vile smelling stench underneath the doors of my church. And when we opened the church up, it was pretty bad inside, and the choir came out to sing the morning anthem, great big choir. I'll never forget, they started out singing, "His love is like a fragrant flower, growing sweeter every hour." And the people just reclined in the pews and laughed open, and all the strain of the election was gone, and everybody seemed to be happy, and I stayed in my pulpit.
And now the stage was set for what was perhaps the most significant event in the career of Arthur J. Moore. At the church's General Conference in Dallas, Texas in 1930, he was proposed for election to bishop, Methodism's highest office. Such deliberations sometimes require 200 or even 300 ballots. But in a rare display of esteem, Pastor Moore was overwhelmingly elected. But for a lesser man, the newly elected bishop's first assignment would have been anything but glorious. Ralph McGill said it best.
He was sent to the frontier of Methodism in America, the western states of Arizona, Montana, California, Washington, and Oregon. His salary was about half what it was when he was pastor, but he was happy on a familiar assignment. It's always seemed to him that lonely people are lonely chiefly for the Word of God. The distant ranch houses, the wagons of sheep herders, the small western towns, sun-baked in summer and raw cold in winter, as well as the cities, came to know his voice. He used automobiles and rode horseback. He attended roundups and rodeos. He founded churches and revived old ones. He lived with the people, and it's no figure of speech to say they loved him. There was and is much tangible evidence of it everywhere he's been. A well-known minister put it this way: while the rest of us were learning Greek and Hebrew, Arthur was learning how to reach the hearts of the people.
But if his first assignment was demanding, the new bishop's second was well nigh impossible. In short, he was to supervise the varied activities of the Methodist Church on 3 continents.
Someone asked me why I had so many different countries under my Episcopal supervision. It relates to the financial depression in America. In 1933, the Episcopal fund from which we get a living wage was so depleted that when the conference met in Jackson, Mississippi, it refused or declined electing any new bishops, which left us with a complement of 11 men instead of 16. And I was young and strong and eager, so they gave me China and Japan and Korea in Asia, Czechoslovakia and Belgium and Poland in Europe, and the Belgian Congo down in Africa. A dear old friend of mine wrote, said, when I want to write Bishop Moore, I don't put down the exact post office, I say somewhere in the universe, and then I write, don't forward it, he'll be by there in a few days. It's not due to any, this unusual, not due to any cleverness of mine, but I was willing, my back was strong, and the world was on fire with war, and the church was in need of frontline leadership, and I tried to give it.
1934 to 1940. A half-dozen years of dashing up and down the world, serving his God and his church. One missionary bishop somehow accomplishing the work that had previously been done by 3. Travel was constant and time-consuming. An airplane ride was a rare luxury. Many of the countries under the bishop's jurisdiction were engaged in war or threatened by war. In fact, he still considers it a minor miracle that he was not imprisoned by the Japanese for criticizing their aggression against the Chinese and his friends Generalissimo and Madame Chiang Kai-shek.
To paraphrase Timothy, it may be said of Bishop Moore that he has attained to far more than the goals he set for himself, and that he has kept the faith with himself, with those who depended on him, and with his God. His congregations in the West, as well as the Far East, have many reasons to remember him with appreciation and affection.
I have watched them with prayer and some concern, but with complete satisfaction. To me, the Generalissimo is a man of deep Christian conviction, a friend of his beloved China, and one of the truly great leaders of our time. It has been my privilege to preach to him more than once. In fact, I've known the Generalissimo and Madame Chong with some degree of intimacy since 1932.
To be sure, the bishop's global circuit riding produced friends without number. Among them were General Douglas MacArthur, Bishop Herbert Welch, who lived to be 106, and requested Bishop Moore to officiate at his funeral because he knew Arthur would keep it cheerful. And from Korea, the land of the morning calm, President Syngman Rhee, who presented the bishop with the Korean National Medal. There were opportunities to return permanently to the States, but the bishop felt he should remain with the fledgling churches in Asia, Europe, and Africa until 1940. Now he was ready to return to Georgia. He had been made president of the Board of Missions in 1938 and served in that office until his retirement in 1960. But one job never seemed to be enough for Bishop Arthur J. Moore. His additional duties during this period, including serving as bishop of the Atlanta Area Conference, which included the state of Georgia and, for a time, Florida. At one time or another, he served on some 24 college boards or committees, and for a year was president of Wesleyan College in Macon. From 1951 until 1960, he was also president of the Council of Bishops. Even after 1940, the traveling was far from over. In his role as president of the Board of Missions, he traveled abroad approximately 100 times. But it was in the continental United States that tragedy almost struck.
One of the dramatic hours of my world travel occurred flying from Colorado Springs headed for Dallas when the plane caught on fire. I had read the Denver paper, and when I stood to give it to a man across the aisle, I discovered that the wing was in flames. I told the stewardess. She ran up and told the pilot, and he immediately turned us toward the earth on a nosedive, and we had a landing which I cannot describe, but it was a miraculous deliverance. As friends, after finding us or discovering we were down, came to see us standing out in that wheat field, one man said, "Did you have prayer?" I said, "Well, I think we did, but there were no atheists out here this afternoon."
Like all men driven by a zeal to serve a higher power, Arthur Moore looks back with some regret at the great lengths of time that it was necessary for him to be away from his family. A family he regards with great affection and pride and some heartbreak. His daughter, Mrs. Evelyn Means of San Antonio, Texas, his youngest son, Arthur Jr., editor of the Methodist magazine World Outlook, his middle son, Wardlaw, treasurer of the North Georgia Conference, and Harry, his oldest son. A preacher like his father, Harry continued to work as long as possible despite some 24 operations and eventual blindness.
Any Christian minister would be proud to see his son, and if it's the eldest one, even more proud, follow him in the work of the Christian ministers. That's what Harry, our eldest son, did. And with great effectiveness, he served churches in Florida and Georgia and led in the establishment of a great and successful retirement home. But blindness overtook him while he was still a young man. And instead of giving up and going into seclusion, he preached a sermon, "So You've Gone Blind," in which he affirmed his faith. And despite blindness, he did some of his most effective service. He has outrun me into the Father's house, but he has left me a legacy of courage that I appreciate, and I'm sure we'll be together again in the Father's house.
In 1949, feeling the need for a conference and recreation center, the bishop, along with 9 Methodist laymen, found the ideal spot on historic St. Simon's Island. Formerly known as the Hamilton Plantation, they named it Epworth by the Sea, after the village of Epworth in England, where John Wesley, one of the founders of Methodism, had lived as a child. In 1960, the Arthur James Moore Museum was erected and contains many of the papers, books, and artifacts collected by the bishop from all over the world. The facility is now open the year round and serves the young and old of all faiths. Bishop Moore regards Epworth by the Sea as perhaps the most vivid and satisfying achievement of his service as a bishop in Georgia. Following his retirement, a group of his Methodist protégés, realizing his persistent need to be up and about his master's work, formed the Arthur J. Moore Evangelistic Association. Bishop Arthur James Moore. How did he happen? Is he man or saint? Lucky or divinely guided? Can it happen? The son of a railroad laborer from a South Georgia village influencing the religious attitude of thousands on 4 continents? The answer is somehow tied up in a personal relationship with the Almighty. Perhaps it's because he, like Francis Asbury, said, "I made an offer of myself."
I would go into the fields or the woods in the afternoon and read my Bible, find a text which had something I thought the people ought to hear, place a piece of pine bark at that particular text, and by night the Bible was full of bark, and I would preach from one piece to the other, using many texts in a single sermon. I understand very well how crude and imperfect was that method. But now that I'm growing old and have had all the honors of the church, I can say to you that I'd rather have the zeal and the faith and the romance of those early days with its imperfection than to be precise and proper and honored and yet let the fire of a great passion die out upon the altar of my life. We've made our mistakes, undoubtedly we have, but I know today that there are millions of people who are happier and freer and living a more abundant life because somebody preached the gospel in the ends of the earth.
Never thought of himself. He thought of somebody else. Still eager, still ready, still willing to go. He'd quote John Wesley. He said, "My vision's dim, my voice is breaking, my memory maybe is not as good as it once was, but I still want the strength to preach the unsearchable riches of Jesus Christ." O God, we thank Thee for Thy Son and servant and our Father, Arthur James Moore. We thank Thee that we lived when he lived, that we were inspired by his messages, that we saw in him the example of the life we ought to live, and that by the grace given through him, we too have been empowered. Help us to live in the memory of his life and ministry, and grant that we may address ourselves in our day to the problems before us and the needs of people at hand, as he did in his. For Jesus' sake, amen.